These plats twist the braids, and I'm peace like that. 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 I'm peace like that.
So we're going to do in this video for soybeans in Ontario what we did in the last video for Ontario corn. That is to understand the pathways of yield improvement that soybean breeders have used over the past 60 years to improve that G component of soybean cropping systems, the pure effective genotype on soybean yield. So this is a figure from the Morrison paper, and this was a study done by Agriculture Canada. This one site, it was the Ottawa Central Experimental Farm. The study was repeated over 4 years. So again, the same cultural practices across all the plots, 13 different varieties released during different decades. And so here we can see year of release on the x-axis, 30 would be the 1930, 90 would be 1990, and then on the y-axis, soybean yield, grams of yield per meter squared. So what we can see is a significant increase in soybean yield over year of release. On average or overall, a 29% increase in seed yield over 59 years of breeding. Okay, and this is the pure G effect because we're keeping environment constant and we're keeping management constant across the varieties. So to answer the question, how did this 23% increase in yield occur over this almost 60 years of breeding? We can start with our first yield improvement pathway, which is that yield equation. And so we can ask the question, and then one of these authors will answer it, one of these scientists, did this yield improvement occur because we had an increased interception and absorption of photosynthetically active radiation over the growing season? So we can use leaf area index as a proxy for the absorption or proportion of radiation absorbed by that crop canopy. And interestingly enough, we see a decrease in leaf area index over time. So newer varieties are higher yielding despite having a significantly lower leaf area index. All right, so what's going on here? I mean, you would think that at least LAI would be held constant. It wouldn't be decreasing over time. To understand what's probably going on here, it's helpful to look back at this graph, which shows you the proportion of solar radiation intercepted by that crop canopy as a function of soybean leaf area index. And what we see here is that leaf area index of 3 in soybean is enough to nearly maximize solar radiation interception. And so what's going on most likely is that this reduction in leaf area index over time in newer soybean varieties is actually not reducing solar radiation interception very much, if at all, and possibly that crop is utilizing those nutrients and all that carbon that would go into building those additional leaves. They're using that carbon in a more effective way, maybe to help power the roots or to fill that grain. Okay. So it stands to reason that maybe reducing LAI is going to be beneficial for yield in this soybean crop because LAI is still not below 3. The next component or part of the yield equation is radiation use efficiency. Now, none of these studies actually measured directly radiation use efficiency. It's a kind of a harder measurement to take in soybeans, so I don't really blame them. So what they did instead is, instead of measuring radiation use efficiency, what they said is we're just going to measure total crop biomass because, of course, radiation use efficiency multiplied by the total amount of PAR absorbed from planting to harvest, that is essentially equal to total crop growth. Okay, so here we have two contradictory findings. All right, so in the first paper, that Morrison et al. Paper that's studying in Ottawa, we've been chatting about, they found no difference in dry weight between across year of release. And so the implication here is that, this part of the yield equation, PAR interception and absorption, as well as radiation use efficiency, did not change over year of release. But a follow-up study published just 2 years later, Kumudimi et al., they found something different. So here, this was a study done at Alora. They used fewer cultivars. They just used two newer and two older cultivars. And what they did was they measured biomass accumulation continuously throughout the season, at different points throughout the season, whereas that Morrison paper just measured it at maturity. And so, unlike the Ottawa study, they find that the newer soybean varieties do have greater growth than older varieties. But the kicker here is that that greater growth, that difference, is only apparent after R5. So during those stages of grain fill, of pod fill, that's when new cultivars sustain much higher total dry weights compared to older cultivars. So we have two studies coming to two different conclusions. The Morrison study in Ottawa saying, dry weight, total crop growth has not increased over year of release, and this Kumudimi study saying, well, actually there has been an increase in total crop growth, but only apparent after R5 during the grain fill or pod fill stages in soybean. And so we have, it's not like one of these studies is wrong and one is right. They were both done correctly, but they came to two different conclusions. And as budding scientists, it's important for us to start recognizing that, this is the reality, right? When we get to the edge of our knowledge, we will end up with studies that are contradictory, and it doesn't mean that they're wrong. But we have to just think more deeply, perhaps, about things like methods and all the auxiliary hypotheses. Going back to that lecture about is agronomy a science? What are the things that Kumudini or Morrison did that they didn't really talk about because they didn't think it was important when they were doing it? Maybe one of them used a drill and one of them used a planter for their soybeans, and that's what's causing these differences. It's probably not that, but it could be things like the growing season. Things like maybe management or environment has a role to play in these different findings. That's beyond what we're talking about in this video. But I'm just saying that we have to become comfortable knowing that, hey, there's no right or wrong answer here. Okay, there's just two different results, two different sets of auxiliary hypotheses tested. And we just have to live with that for now until maybe a better study is published. So the last variable in that yield equation is the harvest index, the proportion of total crop growth that is allocated to the grain. And here the Morrison paper shows a significant increase over year of release, a significant positive trend in harvest index. So modern varieties, newer varieties have a higher harvest index, and that's likely why they're higher yielding as well. So that second avenue of yield improvement open to breeders is changes in phenology and development of that crop, essentially better matching, the timing of developmental events to that given climate. And so what we see here is that across years of release in soybeans, no significant difference in days to maturity, no significant trend across years of release. And so changes in phenology likely had very little effect on yield improvements over time. That third avenue of yield improvement is improvements in density tolerance, essentially allowing higher seeding rates of soybean, increasing yield per unit land area, not necessarily yield per unit plant. Okay, so I could not find any density tolerance measurements in Ontario soybean, but the closest location that I did find data was from Iowa in a study by Jason DeBruin. And so this is an interesting graph. You might have never seen something like this before. Okay, so they took two old and two new soybean varieties, and so they have the new and old varieties. Okay, so we have on the x-axis plant density, plants per meter squared. That's easy enough to understand. On the left, we have yield expressed in terms of grams per meter squared, so per unit land area. And on the right, we have yield grams per plant. So two different ways to express yield. So let's look first at yield per unit plant. Okay, so we have here an exponential decay function that well describes how yield per unit plant declines with increasing plant density. Again, increasing density increases density dependent stresses such as nutrient stress, water stress, and light stress, competition for these resources. And so per plant yield is going to go down, and it goes down in a exponential decay function. And what De Bruin and Peterson find is that this exponential decay function is essentially identical between the new and old varieties. So new and old varieties behave very similarly when exposed to density stress. The only difference is that per plant yield is slightly higher in newer varieties at every plant density, but that reaction to increasing plant density stress is the same. And so they conclude that, there's no evidence that new soybean varieties have a higher plant density tolerance. Now, let's go to yield expressed on a per unit land area. And that's the two highest lines where you see a plateau. It rises with increasing plant density and then reaches a plateau. And so what we see here is that the plateau, the optimum plant density is again quite similar between the new and old varieties. Again, indicating that it's not like newer varieties can be planted at a higher plant density. The optimum plant density is quite similar. You can see on the x-axis the two arrows. But what's different is at that plant density, just per yield per unit area is just a lot higher in those newer varieties. So let's wrap this video up. In conclusion, what were the mechanisms of yield improvement that breeders use to increase soybean yields, that pure G component of soybean crop production in Ontario, independent of environment, independent of management? So let's start out first with the yield equation. So did total soybean growth increase with breeding? Total biomass accumulation, in other words. And the answer is the jury is still out. Okay. One study found that there was no change in total crop growth, biomass accumulation over time. Another study found that newer varieties of soybean did have higher crop biomass accumulation, but only after R5. Okay, so we're not 100% sure. One study did find that LAI decreased significantly with newer varieties, but that decrease in LAI did not reduce the total amount of PAR intercepted by that soybean crop. Again, we can go back and talk about why. So crop growth, question mark, not sure. Harvest index, yes. Harvest index increased significantly in soybean in newer varieties. And that was found in the Morrison Ottawa paper and the Alora paper by Kumudini. Looking at changes in phenology or development of that soybean crop, there has been no evidence that newer varieties have different, drastically different rates of development or durations of growth. Okay, so that has not changed. Similarly, with density tolerance, no evidence that density tolerance has improved over time with newer soybean varieties. And so, in conclusion, what is most likely happening is that newer soybean varieties have a much higher harvest index, and maybe there's something going on with total biomass accumulation, total crop growth, but no difference in phenology or density tolerance. So again, for the purposes of this lecture, of this class, you could say, we're only talking about three mechanisms of yield improvement, three possible pathways, but in reality, there are many other ones. And so just as an example, I'm not going to really ask you to memorize this, but as an example, newer soybean varieties have a much higher, a much greater ability to fix nitrogen. Nitrogen, soybeans are legumes. They can fix more nitrogen, especially during their grain fill period. And so there's a greater innate ability to fix nitrogen in modern varieties, which is possibly also increasing yield as well. But again, I just wanted to let you know that, I'm simplifying things here by only talking about three avenues of yield improvement. But that's fine for this class. That's plenty.